Gentleman yield.
Yes.
Gentleman yields.
I would ask the gentleman, and I would note that he said a moment ago that this bill does not affect or outlaw abortion. I would ask the gentleman, is it his goal that while this bill may not outlaw abortion, it sets the platform for doing so?
Mr. Speaker, you'd have to be completely obtuse not to understand that that is one of the things that I have worked for at least 20 years in this body. I was the originator of the Hyde Amendment in Congress. So to the extent this or any other matter can lead to a circumstance where abortion might be illegal, I guess so.
Would the gentleman yield for another question, Mr. Speaker?
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
Gentleman yields.
The gentleman has said that he is desirous of giving cells or a zygote property rights, and that is one of the purposes of this bill. I would ask the gentleman, would he suggest that the cell be able to sue the mother for drinking drugs, for overindulging in sugar? And if so, how would he be an advocate, and would he have a guardian, or she, the zygote, have a guardian to argue those rights?
Mr. Speaker, was it Dr. Seuss? Everyone's a person, no matter how small. Item number 6, nothing in this section shall be interpreted as creating a cause of action against a woman for indirectly harming her unborn child by failing to properly care for herself or by failing to follow any particular program of prenatal care.
Would the gentleman yield for another question?
Gentleman yield.
Yes.
Gentleman yields.
I'd ask the gentleman, given his conversation with CBS News on the 23rd of November, wherein he talked about that this legislation would give cells property ownership and other legal rights, I'm wondering what specific property rights or other legal rights is the gentleman desirous of creating with the zygote with this bill?
Mr. Speaker, zygote is a Latin term, and I would hope the gentleman would use English terms in here. I'm not familiar with what that purports to say. I would never use the language, give cells rights. I would direct him to Prosser on torts, where he can find an ample discussion on the property rights of divesting, giving children whose father dies before their birth access to their wills and estates. And I think that's a satisfactory enough conversation, as well as the master of the Constitution, Edward S. Corwin, who summarily criticized the Roe v. Wade decision in in the late 1973, and others, as well as pro-abortion advocates, none of whom found a right to privacy in the Constitution to create a right to abortion. Mr. Speaker, I have put in bills which would, if the Supreme Court reversed itself, give the Attorney General 6 months to make a determination that, in fact, Roe v. Wade was reversed, and we would revert back to the statute that we had, I believe, from 1859, initiated by Dr. Horatio R. Storer, who kind of created the discipline of OB in the United States and survived until about 1969. This is not that bill. I'm always candid with what I'm doing. This bill doesn't do that. As a matter of fact, the young lady who brought this to my attention, I did not initially want to do this. And you can ask her if you want about this, and I agreed after a while to use this approach. So I hope that satisfies the gentleman's inquiry.
Would the gentleman yield for another question?
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields.
Well, I preface it by saying, well, I'm not satisfied because I still don't know what property rights. I'll move on. I'd ask the gentleman, since he said in his summary of the bill, and I'm quoting him, that no woman has been prosecuted in the military environment with this, quote, this will have no effect on criminalization, and, quote, there's no ability to prosecute, all of which the gentleman said a few moments ago. Can he tell me what he meant when he said 2 months ago, quote, the personhood bill would give the state the constitutional backbone to go back to old laws which criminalized abortion? Slightly confused, and if he could just clear that up for me.
I hope I can enlighten the gentleman and undo his confusion. Mr. Speaker, this by itself does not criminalize abortion. It cannot do it. It provides no penalty. It doesn't directly attack Roe versus Wade. A bill which may come over from the other body whose name will not pass my lips because it says it creates a tort. You could say, well, are we creating a tort for a human being? Does this fall under the 14th Amendment definition of person? All this is speculative. You can take this step. You do not have to take the second step or third step that would be required to mount an attack on Roe versus Wade, the likelihood of overturning of which, with the current occupant of the White House appointing justices, I would suggest is somewhat remote.
Would the gentleman yield for another question, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes.
The gentleman yields.
Given that the gentleman said that the real intent of this legislation is to create a civil action for the fetus, then I would ask the gentleman, why not just amend Section 8.01-50 of the Code of Virginia, the wrongful death statute, to do exactly in that statute what the gentleman purports or claims to want to do?
I've been advised that you should bring your own bill, but I hope he does. But the purpose that I have here is not limited to that. I want the courts to understand that when they look at the child in utero before birth, they're considering a human being in these aspects. That's all it does. It has the effect, I would suggest, of creating a tort. And in Missouri, it has had no other effect dealing with birth control, limiting abortion, or any such thing, or having women being charged with, homicide violations because they have a miscarriage.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for another question?
Gentleman yield?
All day I'll yield, yes, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, if he keeps asking.
I think the gentleman yield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that a basic tenet of statutory construction is that if you change one section of the code and it affects another, you have to necessarily amend that code section. Can the gentleman tell me why he did not amend Section 8.1-50, since it would necessarily have an effect on this current HB1?
I put in a statute that was sustained by the Supreme Court, which had the effect of doing the same thing. The purpose is to recognize unborn children as human beings without changing the abortion laws of the Commonwealth or those rights that are claimed by the U.S. Supreme Court. So that's why it was done that way.
The gentleman yield for another question.
Gentleman yield?
Yes?
I would ask the gentleman, since he has repeatedly referred to the Missouri law, which was upheld by the Supreme Court in Webster, I would ask the gentleman, isn't it true that the Supreme Court ruled on the substantive Missouri law and not the preamble to the Missouri law, and that indeed his legislation copies the preamble to the Missouri law, which the Supreme Court of the United States never even ruled on?
Well, they reversed the Court of Appeals, which declared that provision of the Missouri law unconstitutional. So I would suggest to the gentleman, yes, they did rule on it. And I have here Vernon's annotated statutes, Mr. Speaker. Chapter 1, Laws, Enforce, and Construction of Statutes. 1.205, life begins at conception. Unborn child, failure to provide prenatal care, no cause of action for, and it follows the language we have here, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yield for another question.
Yes?
Is it the gentleman's position to the members of this body that...
Does the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman yield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is it the gentleman's position to the members of this body that the Supreme Court's decision in Webster actually ruled on the preamble of the Missouri statute?
It's the Supreme Court's position that they reversed the District Court and the Court of Appeals in declaring the preamble language, which is now statutory language in Missouri, which I would make statutory language here. They reversed that claim that it was unconstitutional.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for a final question?
Will the gentleman yield for a final question?
For the first final question, yes.
Gentleman yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My first and last final question is this. Given that 99% of the bills drafted that come before this body are drafted by legislative services, would you tell the body whether or not your bill was drafted by legislative services or came from some other source?
It was drafted by a very competent young woman attorney, Rita Dunaway, who probably is watching this debate right now and wondering what we're doing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman.